So welcome everyone to our second California Equity Briefing of 2020. My name is Axel Santana and I'm an associate at PolicyLink. I hope you all are doing well as can be in these times. Thanks again for joining us virtually today. Some of you may be familiar with us, but for those of you who aren't, every year for the past 6 years, PolicyLink has hosted, and many times in partnership with various legislative caucuses, a series of briefings meant to educate and inform legislative staff and partners about various equity issues that are important to our communities of color and low-income communities across California. And so we typically host these in person in Sacramento, but as you can imagine, we've had to sort of shift to a virtual format. So thanks for trying this out with us, and we hope you still find value in these briefings. And so today I'm joined by my colleague Marc Philpart, Managing Director at PolicyLink and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, and several other awesome guest speakers who will be leading us in a conversation around Healing Together, which is a new campaign that engages men and people of all genders in the work to build safe and accountable communities by focusing on healing, gender justice, and racial equity instead of punishment to end intimate partner violence. And so, as a reminder, please keep yourselves on mute throughout the call, and then also feel free to chat in any questions or comments as we go through the presentations. And so with that, I think I'll pass it on to Marc.
Thank you, Axel, and thank you everyone for joining. As Axel mentioned, my name is Marc Philpart. I use he, him, his pronouns. Managing Director at PolicyLink and support the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Apologies to those of you who can hear my children in the background. As you know, this pandemic and the work from home life is taking its toll on so many of us, but my kids are a little rambunctious from being cooped up. And so you'll hear lots of screaming from time to time throughout the presentation. Let me just say that for our part as PolicyLink and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, we're incredibly honored and humbled to be involved in this work. As you all know, intimate partner violence is a frightening reality for millions of Californians and a public health crisis. Black, Native American, bisexual women, and transgender people experience the highest rates of partner violence. And for us, you know, this experience of violence is bigger than an interpersonal set of reactions, right, and behaviors. It is more about the structural harm, racism, and persistent kind of intergenerational poverty that is a byproduct of all the structural inequity in our society that we believe kind of promulgates the violence that people experience in their homes and their communities. And so we've taken a structural kind of analysis to this question of violence and how we interrupt violence, and have been for the past few years in deep partnership with several of the people who you'll hear from today who represent some of the leading edge thinkers in the field around how to address these issues. The campaign that we recently launched, Healing Together, is one that we began in earnest several years ago in deep conversation with groups like the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, where we sought to build on the work of radical feminists who have really been putting their lives on the line to save lives for the past half century. So for the past 50 years, we've seen leaders really step up and commit to the interruption of violence in ways that we think have been phenomenal. And that leadership is the leadership who we work with and, you know, whose shoulders we stand on as we are trying to take the work to this new phase. We believe that our approach in terms of thinking about some of the structural racism that promulgates violence is an approach that is becoming increasingly popular in terms of how people are thinking about this question, because we see it coming up in so many different communities where grassroots organizers and people who are in anti-violence work more broadly are starting to question more concretely, I would say, what the relationship is to violence that their community organizations may have, and how they can be more involved in promoting alternative responses to violence. And so our work is really rooted in an analysis that is grounded in a different set of politics. And we have a different set of responses that we're proposing in terms of how to respond to violence. We believe that the current system is failing on many fronts. When we look at the statistics, we see that over half of the people who report violence don't feel comfortable with the response that they receive, and that they feel actually a lack of safety when police are called. And so we're trying to further investment and advocacy in alternative responses to violence, so that people who are most likely to experience it are put in a different position and have access to responses that actually are going to support their healing and also further accountability. Most people want the violence to stop. They don't necessarily want to find themselves in a more precarious situation by virtue of having to rely on the police. So we are utilizing this platform and this opportunity today with all of you to talk a little bit more about this. You'll hear from some experts in the field who will dig into their work and share opportunities for you to be able to support them in terms of thinking about the way in which their efforts may connect to policy and systems change opportunities. And so, you know, it would be good for many of you who are participating to ask questions, to be involved in the chat, and to, you know, not be shy about trying to connect with people to build a long-term relationship. Again, these are some of the leading experts in the field. We're happy to be in partnership with them through the Healing Together campaign and in support of some of their work. We've had over 90 organizations sign on to the Healing Together campaign. Some of our partners who have signed on to this campaign are even on the phone, who are not necessarily presenting today, but they're here in support. And so just want to give a shout out to some of them. Jess Bartholow with the Western Center, and Jackie Marakin, who's also with the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, Amika Mota with the Young Women's Freedom Center, and so many others. So we're excited to be able to talk to you today and look forward to your questions and your engagement. I'm going to stop here and go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Skipp Townsend is with Second Call, and Skipp is a true leader in South Central LA. He's been leading a men's healing and intervention program. And this is a really central part of our campaign when we think about healing together. One of the things that we have been very intentional about is the need to engage men as part of the conversation around healing and accountability, because we know that men have been in many instances, and primarily the producers of violence are the people who are most often involved in causing harm. And so by engaging them, we believe that we have an opportunity to interrupt cycles of violence. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn to you, Skipp.
Well, thank you for that, Marc. I truly appreciate it. I'm honored and blessed to be here with all of you this afternoon. Let me start off by saying that by being a batter's intervention professional and I facilitate classes, I often find that when I'm talking, I'm speaking, that sometimes it triggers individuals who have suffered through domestic violence. So I want to say first and foremost, if anyone is offended or triggered by anything that I say, it is not my intention to trigger you or offend you, but I deal with the suspects primarily. I deal with the individuals that we know have a history of violence and that have been dealing with all of their challenges and obstacles through violence. So what I've done with Second Call is to help create an emotionally safe place for a person who never would speak about how they feel to talk about how they deal with anger, how they deal with emotions, how they deal with low self-esteem or depression as a man. Um, there are systemic things that are happening that have happened in the past. And I want to go back not to post-traumatic stress disorder, but to post-slavery. There are ways that the culture, and forgive me if I'm only speaking about one culture, or maybe I'm speaking about more, but the culture led to what we have today. A good example would be something that my mother taught me before I left the house was that if someone hit me, I need to hit them back. They're bigger than me, I need to pick up something. So the culture that's being taught and is being taught to answer every question with violence. Every obstacle or challenge is to be answered with violence. And then the culture of going to jail, going to prison, it's steadfast in that commitment to violence. So a lot of times individuals that we've dealt with find that they don't know the healthy way to express themselves or explain themselves. And what happens is they get into relationships. And if I have two sick individuals, and I'm saying mentally sick, not physically sick, but emotionally sick, that don't have never seen a healthy relationship, then they don't know what it looks like. One of the things that we help to do is to help men understand that some of our choices are not healthy, and it's not because we're bad people, but because of the fact that I've never been exposed to a healthy relationship. If I've never seen a healthy relationship, I'm gonna think to myself that if I don't hit someone, that this is healthy behavior, not knowing that I can harm them emotionally and verbally and in other ways, financially and things like that. So I think that one of the things that we have accomplished with Second Call, and it wasn't on purpose. Let me not take credit for this because my main objective was to stop the violence in the community. And I was really talking about gang violence. And I came across so many people who wanted to be employed. They said, well, Skipp, I need a job. I need to get into a career. And through that, I would see that they would work maybe 1 week and quit. They might, show up late, show up drunk, show up high. So there was a number of root causes that needed to be addressed. And when we talk about law enforcement is not in the position to deal with root causes. When law enforcement shows up to a domestic violence case, they're primarily looking for, is there a crime? Is there someone that I can arrest? Is there some way that I can solve the situation by putting someone in handcuffs? Which doesn't help the family. I think that what we do at Second Call and what's being done with most domestic violence agencies is we are finding ways to heal the family, finding ways to heal the community. And we're not necessarily looking to take the father out the home. We're not looking to take the children out the home. We're not looking to separate the family. How can we help that family heal? And I think that is priority number one. And that is why law enforcement is the wrong person to show up to a domestic violence call. I think from my understanding that the three main causes of law enforcement deaths are car accidents, suicide, and domestic violence calls. And I think it's because that they are primarily not trained properly to deal with situations where you have to begin the healing process. So I thank you guys for the opportunity to speak on the work that we do at Second Call in Southern California. And once again, this is about healing, and whatever I can do to help the healing process, I'm here. So thank you, Marc, for bringing me into this conversation.
Thank you, Skipp. And if I can, I'm just going to ask you a quick question. As someone who runs a better intervention program, you have unique insight into this. after having worked with men who've caused harm, what are the biggest challenges to supporting them on their journey to healing and peace? Oftentimes, we know that people want to cast people out once they've caused harm, but you have, through your programming, called them in and found a way to kind of help them onto a healing journey. Can you talk about some of the challenges you face in doing that?
Yes, well, first, let me say it's not just men. So we have women's group too. And we have, I want to say, sometimes women are outnumbered by the men, but a second call. No, we have an equal group for our men and women classes. So I think that some of the challenges, and really, I don't want to say they're challenges, but the individuals who first come, they're mandated by court, a judge, probation, or parole. They come in with the attitude is, I don't need to be here. I'm not supposed to be here. And that is one of our challenges, but it's not a challenge to me because what I like to do in week number 5 or week number 6, see the change, see the breakdown, see the individual who came in, riled up and thinking that he was a victim and blaming other people, to seeing how it is that he or she could have done something different, how they could have maybe approached the situation in a better way. So I would say that the challenges and obstacles that we face, because I have 7 trained batters interventionists, myself included, and 6 of us are system impacted, been to jail, been to prison, and in situations ourselves, and I am the only male on that 7. So I'm talking about 5 women who have done, I would say, close to 70 years worth of prison time if I added it all up. So I think that makes us effective. So our obstacles and challenges that we have are really opportunities for us to help change people around.
Thank you, Skipp. Next, I'm going to turn to a community organization that is really taking a unique approach to this question of violence. Fathers and Families of San Joaquin has been a pioneer in the Stockton area, really focused on whole system, whole person approaches, whole family approaches to addressing the needs of the most vulnerable Stocktonians. And I'm going to turn to Eduardo and Sammy to kind of give you a little bit more insight into some of their work.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eduardo Crabbe, and I work for Fathers and Families of San Joaquin. I say that proudly too, right? Because before Fathers and Families of San Joaquin, I stumbled in as a participant, right? I stumbled in as coming in looking for healing. This was 5 years ago. Today, I'm a department manager. I work with the reentry population, right? But prior to Fathers and Families, like I said, I stumbled in. I was on parole, probation, and CPS at the same time, right? Some of this was I was because I was a perpetrator, right? But also they didn't talk about when I was a victim. I started to see my first act of violence at about 5 years old, right? See my mother get beat, right? At 5 years old. And I ended in the system about, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, 3 terms in prison, right? Never in between that victim and that perpetrator did I find healing within the system, right? It wasn't until I came into a community-based organization that gave me a sense of community, some guidelines to healing, some direction, right? To bring my whole family together as one and address these issues, right? So yeah, I'm a father of 4. I'm a single parent of 2 kids, 5 and 6. You might hear them banging on the door in a little bit, right? They do that a lot. They want my love. They want all my attention, all daddy's attention, right? And that's what brought me to the agency too, right? I wanted to become a better father, right? I didn't want my kids to go through the system, which I went through, foster cares, juvenile halls, um, prisons, right? I didn't want them to grow up like that, right? They, and that's just a little brief introduction. I don't know if you want to take it away, Sammy, or a little further.
I just, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Mark and everyone else for putting this together. I want to give a shout out to Kaylin and Sybil and all the folks that, continue to, kind of create spaces like this where we can gather and talk about very important issues in terms of what's causing the most harm to our communities and our families, and have opportunities to have solution-based conversations to persistent problems that have plagued our community for far too long. And so that's what brings us here, to find solutions so our children are afforded an opportunity that new memories, new lineage, new safer environments that maybe some of us were not afforded growing up. And I think that it's really important that we understand this issue and its relationship to everything else. In order to understand something, you got to understand how it's connected to a lot of other things. And this issue has really devastated our communities. Their data tells the story in terms of a really epic failure of a system to keep children, families, in particular people of color, safe. We have seen the actual, the empirical data tells the story of how often and how many of our children of color have been removed from their families, and many of them end up incarcerated. And they themselves continue down this kind of legacy of just of disinvestment and disconnection and separation and destabilization of communities of color. And the system has not changed at all. If anything, we know that it has actually really failed at intervening in proper ways at times when we needed it the most. And I think that families and communities have long struggled to try to find solutions to these very issues. And I think someone like Eddie, I think, first of all, I'd like to just say thank you to Eddie for making him so vulnerable and sharing his story. It's not easy to do that. To come into this group and actually share your story, it takes a lot of courage. And we've seen that over and over, men and women, families actually sharing their stories with us of the longing to actually heal and be transformed. We actually been doing this work for a while now. There's just some very particular things that I think have came out of this work from families themselves, from those impacted, both mamas and papas, that I think I'd like to share, if that's okay. Essentially, that moving forward, we've done a whole report on this, on the healing together, because we heal best when we heal together. When whole families heal, a whole community can heal, and the impact has been very, very evident. We have had, as we continue to heal families, this is actually contributing to a healthier society where actually violence has dropped significantly. I don't know anywhere else that's had a actually 40% drop in violent crime. It's actually affected the trajectory and allowed us to see our humanity more, to be in spaces together more, to create safe spaces for children and families. And ultimately, what families themselves have actually lifted up is that they want to see more opportunities for healing services for families that are impacted by intimate partner violence, that are community-based, trauma-informed, to heal individuals, families, and communities. That they want equitable funding for awareness and outreach activities that address systemic and cultural barriers with an emphasis on communities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And that they want to see investment in healing schools models, that it begins early on, that our children that are growing up in homes where the rhythm is off need to have access to healing in schools and not punishment in schools. You see this trajectory over time where children are actually, because of their trauma they're experiencing, how many of us know children that have been exposed to domestic violence and go to schools and get punished and they don't get healing services? So we see this happen over and over and over again with our families. And I just think it's a really bold and really timely conversation to talk about what really does our community need? How do we look at this issue, the social, historical, institutional traumas that Mr. Townsend was talking about, that others are going to talk about, and how can we properly intervene to create new realities, new opportunities, and transform our communities like we're seeing right now in Stockton. It's not a time to go back to the dark past. It's a time to actually advance human progress. And this is what we're doing. While we heal together, we're healing whole families, and we're noticing the impact in our community here in Stockton. So I want to thank you all for allowing us into this space.
Thank you, Eduardo and Sammy. And Eduardo, just can't appreciate you enough for sharing your story. Unfortunately, there are way too many young people who grow up witnessing the same type of violence that you articulated. And in fact, we have, several accounts that we've tried to chronicle within the Healing Together report that many of you can find on our website. And one of the things that I'm curious about is, what did you feel you needed in that moment? And then the question that I have for you, Sammy, is, how have you and FFSJ tried to approach this issue of interpersonal violence in terms of like, how have y'all tried to create the interventions and supports that people need? And what are the challenges in doing that?
So at that moment, at that time, right, what I needed, what I was feeling, I was walking across the street, right, when I seen the agency, said Fathers and Families of San Joaquin, right? Said, I'm a father, I want to be a father. I'm fighting for my daughter that's in the system right now, right? She was born, taken away from CPS. CPS would not give me any action because of my criminal record, right? Because of my past. And what I needed at that point in time was I needed a space, right? I needed a space where other people with no judgment that I could confine in, right? And I walked in those doors, and from there, I was exposed to all these other things, right? When's the first time you seen harm? I had to think about that one, 5 years old. How did it affect you, right? What were you feeling like? Do you want that same trauma to go to your kids? Let's look back at your past. Let's look at your family. It was a historical thing that would keep on continuing if I didn't stop the process, right? And what did I need at that time? I needed space and I needed community, right? And if that space and if that community center wasn't there at that time, it would have been a different story because I would have reverted to my old ways. I was ending up at my CPS officer's house, just to try to talk to her, right? So it could have been a different route. But yeah, that's what people need. They need the space. They need community. They need people that's been there, that's done that, that's went through that could break the stigma of it's okay to heal, right? Because if you're healthy, then your kids will be healthy, right? So yeah, go ahead, take it away, sir.
I remember that day when Eduardo walked in, and I remember the day when he first held his little girl in his arms, and I remember the day when he participated in his first healing circle, and I remember all the different moments that he did the work. People like Eduardo want to do the work on themselves, but they need a space, safe places with safe people that can help them, guide them, to remind them that they are truly a blessing and sacred, and their children are a blessing and sacred, and that this is really about that healing generations that have been exposed to all of this state, social, historical, institutional traumas that have gone unresolved and perpetuate a system itself versus, kind of really contributing to the healing and harmony in our families and our communities that we desperately desire and need. So the reality is we have a saying here, EBP plus, the plus is us, that we have experience and evidence to demonstrate that this is effective, that people are safer as a result. We also know that when the boys heal, the men will show up, and that there's unresolved trauma. That's the number one issue with men in our communities, that unresolved trauma that they haven't gotten addressed in prisons or in any other carceral setting, but rather community and family and extended family can help them kind of heal. And I think that's evident based on what we see, tangible evidence of men, women, families healing. And that is actually a more sound public safety strategy. I think that, again, loving yourself in a society that teaches you to hate yourself is a revolutionary act. And we want our young people and our families and our communities to love themselves radically and demand, that they have proper interventions and supports and investments in them. And some of the summary themes in terms of our interventions, I think, Marc, that are really important are understanding the pervasiveness of generational trauma and exposure as early as childhood and on. I think the prevalence of substance abuse and, kind of a misdiagnosis and folks medicating and that kind of stuff that really is a really important factor. And how do we dislodge that pain of generations, right? And then also the need for culturally rooted approaches. And actually, again, that BT model, been there, done that. There's evidence. We are the metrics. Eduardo is the measuring stick. Eduardo is the evidence that it's working. I think that his trajectory and his life trajectory is the story of so many of our young men. And thankfully, we were there to help support him. But like I said, these young men do the work when they walk in. They do have to work. All we do is help guide the process, facilitate the process of transformation. And that's the easier part. I think that oftentimes we have seen the system kind of usurp that and actually undermine that healing because they have to pay for classes and they're poor. How are you going to pay for it? And then they get punished. And then, it just really is just not focused on healing. And our focus is an intentional healing centered humanist approach to this work.
And just speaking about punishment, it's an ongoing punishment, right? You don't get to pay for those classes, then and sometimes you can't go see your family and you can't heal together, right? They want to see other things, right? I don't sit here and speak all good on fathers and families because I work for them, right? I actually ended up, they actually, for real, I actually started my own business. They helped me, guided me to my own business because I was formerly incarcerated. I couldn't get a job, had all these different things on. And I started hiring all kinds of other formerly incarcerated, right? And then I said, man, I want to work at that place. I believe in this model. I believe in what they do, right? And I left that business behind. And I was making a lot of money at that time, right? To come and help guide other people that's been in my situation. But yeah, you speak more punishment, right? I'm my first time going in prison, 23, right? I was from like juvenile hall, 16 to 18, right? But then 23, did 5 years, right? Under being a perpetrator, right? And at no time was anything domestic violence ever addressed, right? They didn't I can't remember one class, right? When I got out, I went to go get to go back to court for my kids, start up visitation, start that process, right? I go tell my parole officer all the good work I'm doing, right? My parole officer says, you know what? Because of your case, if you go back into court, you didn't complete these classes, that we're gonna go into court and we're gonna lock you up. Like I'm one step away from joint custody. I'm one more court date, right? I'm already doing my visitation. So there's a lot of punishment. There's no I haven't seen nothing being addressed. For a lot of the guys that I work with too, that come home, they come home from domestic violence situations. They're incarcerated from domestic violence. And most of the time it's just punishment. Hey, you got to go pay for these classes or we're going to lock you up, right?
Thank you, Eduardo. I appreciate that. This idea that punishment somehow equals healing, or punishment equals accountability even, is one that is false, and we must debunk it. And I think we can't ground our policies in that approach. It's too costly. I'm going to turn to our next presenter, Kat Brooks. Kat has been a longtime organizer and advocate fighting against police brutality, police terror in Oakland and throughout California and the country. And this intersection has really been key for us. And this partnership has really been critical because through Kat's leadership, we began to look at these alternative approaches to ending intimate partner violence through a different lens. How can we foster safety in ways that don't rely on the police? Kat, I'm going to turn to you and would love to hear you share with folks a little bit more about what you do and your story about how you came to this work.
I was on mute, the most said words of the year 2020. Thank you, Marc. Honored to be sitting on this panel with everybody. So yeah, to Marc's point, I come to this work actually via two paths, right? So one is through my work around interrupting and eradicating state violence in communities of color, which is the mission of the Anti-Police Terror Project, of which I am the co-founder. The second is as a survivor, right? And I'm a survivor of not one, but multiple relationships that had interpersonal violence. But the most important one is the first one. When I was 18 and I was married to an abuser. And one particular evening, he beat me particularly badly. And he called the police. And the police came. He was a white man, which is I think incredibly important to this story. And we lived in not an affluent neighborhood, but we weren't in the hood, right? And there weren't a lot of people that looked like me around. But the cops came. I was clearly battered. He had no markings or anything on him whatsoever. And I was the one who went to jail. And not only did I go to jail, but then there was a big fight with the district attorney's office, who was determined to press charges. And so here I am, 18, trying to get through college, and had lived through this really traumatic experience, and then only to be re-brutalized by the system. And what that taught me, right, was that the system was not a place that I was ever going to get help. And I never called the police again, not in that relationship and not in any other relationship. And that was before I made a political decision that I was never going to call the police in any situation. It was a personal decision, because what I was really clear about, and what other women and folks that are survivors of interpersonal violence are really clear about, is that when you call the police, they very rarely make things better, right? And that actually far too often they either escalate things or make things worse. And when I say make things worse, I mean either somebody goes to jail, somebody gets beaten up, and in the most egregious cases, right, as we see far too often in this country, somebody ends up dead. And so for us at the Anti-Police Terror Project, one of the things that we've been trying to figure out is how we interrupt and how we end state-sponsored violence. And what the data tells us is that the way that happens is by reducing the number of engagements that our people have with law enforcement. It's not about more training. It's not about body cameras. It's not about any of those things that we've been dumping thousands of wasted dollars into over the years. It is literally about untangling law enforcement from our communities and from our people. The other reason that we've been focusing on this is that we also know that because people aren't calling the police, they're not getting help, right? So it's not that folks don't need help. And what that does is leave people in dangerous situations that also can lead to people losing, life and or limb. And then the third thing is that it doesn't work. Utilizing law enforcement does nothing to reduce levels of interpersonal violence. It does nothing to create healing. It does nothing to restore. And it actually moves us further away from one of the things that we know actually keeps communities safe, and those are whole and healthy families, right? It's not perpetuating this cycle of violence continuously with policing and incarceration, and then dumping somebody back into community without any support. And as quiet as it's kept, society has said that when there's incidents of interpersonal violence, right, that it means that families should separate or be separated. But very often, actually, that's not what families want. Families want to figure out how we stay together, how we keep, both parents in the home, how children can still engage with both sets of parents. We just want the violence to stop. And that is not the role of law enforcement. And so when we look at what actually keeps us safe, right? Trauma supports, mental health supports, and whole families. And then the other thing for us is that we take responsibility as organizers. We talk a lot about in abolition and ending the utilization of law enforcement to create safe communities. But as organizers, what have we actually done to create alternative models for communities to look to as something that they can do differently, right? All of us in this country are indoctrinated to believe that police keep us safe. We're taught from a very young age that cops are the ones who get the kitties out of the tree, and that's who we're supposed to call when something goes wrong. And that creates a really interesting dynamic for Black and brown communities in particular. It's like cognitive dissonance, right? Like we're told on this hand, and it's in our brains on this side, that something's wrong, I call 911, but on this side is the lived experience of every time I've called 911, it's resulted in increased violence. And then we're left with what to do. And so the default is 911. And I can say, even as someone who made a political decision 15 years ago that I was never going to call the police again, when I see something going wrong or I feel like I'm in danger, that's still my first instinct, right, is to call 911. And so as we're having conversations about defunding police and we're seeing the pushback from communities, we can't be mad at those communities because we've done nothing to counter the narrative about what actually keeps us safe. And so we've spent time developing a model for response to interpersonal violence that doesn't rely on law enforcement. And I know we're running low on time, Marc. I'm just going to really quickly go through a few of those principles. And this wasn't that we sat at APTP and Justice Teams Network and we decided what the model should look like. This is a conversation. This is the result of lots and lots and lots of conversations with experts in the field and with survivors and with folks that have perpetrated violence. So a couple of the key principles and considerations about when creating these models. And I also want to say, like, it's not going to be the same in every single community, right? So the model that works in Oakland is not necessarily going to work in Stockton, but the principles are transferable, right? So local, and that's the first principle, that a community first model has got to be most effective if it's highly localized, right? Either at the neighborhood level or block by block. Churches, mosques, synagogues, et cetera, owned and operated inside that community. For us, we're really interested in pulling the response model out of traditional models, institutions, and agencies of response that tend to be connected to law enforcement. Broad community involvement and ownership. And some of this has to do with even how our communities think about domestic violence, right? Because when you see what's on the media and how it's talked about, some of this is about having conversations about what actual safety looks like, and destigmatizing and reworking the conversations we're having about domestic violence and the causations of it. 3, survivor-centeredness and self-determination. And that's, we're going back to that we don't get to walk into someone's home or relationship or family and tell them what it is that they need to do in order to deal with their situation. They're the shot callers, right? So if you're coming into my house to engage me around something that's happening inside of my home, I'm the expert on what's happening inside of my home. And your job, if you're really there to help me, is to help me facilitate the outcome that I want, free from your opinions about what it is and how we should move forward. Safety, and this is a real conversation that we've had to have both in our mental health response model that doesn't rely on 911 and this one too, right? Because these situations can be volatile, they can be dangerous, and it's something that we have to be realistic about. And that's one of the difficult conversations we've had with, so Brooks have made a political personal decision and never call the police. That's ever, under any circumstances, that's not something we can impose on this model. We do have what does escalation look like? When does law enforcement have to be involved? And what community security teams can we put in place so that we actually have a barrier to having to deal with law enforcement initially? My computer's freezing. Of course it is. Sorry. Culturally rooted and appropriate, right? And so in different communities, we have different ideas about what help and resources and therapy and all of those things look like. And again, that's not something that we should be imposing with our model. Whole family interventions, other folks on this call that do that work have spoken to that better than I can. What is ongoing support? This isn't a situation where you can just sort of tap in and then tap out. And so that's also why it's so important that it's local and it's rooted and situated in community institutions so that there can be stability and ongoing support for the families and situations. It's important to have relationships. You don't get to just parachute in and tell a community how and when and why to respond. And then again, that's an ongoing thing. And then here we have law enforcement as the last resort. And so it's been interesting developing this model and the resistance. We've got a rapid response model to incidents of state-sponsored violence. We've got a rapid response model to mental health crisis. This is the one where we get the most resistance, even from people that call themselves abolitionists, right? And and again, it goes back to the way in which community looks at domestic violence, the way in which community incident folks that are engaged in these situations are demonized. And I date myself when I talk about this. There was a movie that came out with Farrah Fawcett in the 80s called The Burning Bed, right? And so that's like the level of violence that people think about when they're thinking about domestic violence, as opposed to the gradations, right, of interpersonal violence and what causes and resolutions could look like. And so for us, creating the model, easy is not the right word, but because it's something that our organization specializes in, that hasn't been the difficult part. The difficult part has been about trying to get the buy-in, right? Even from organizations that I would consider allies in other pieces of the work. So.
Kat, thank you so much for sharing that. And obviously all these presentations deserve way more exploration than we have time for today. But just really quickly, can you say a bit about how you've been thinking about engaging the DV field as you've been doing this work? Because I know your roots and your orientation has really been coming from a community organizing perspective, which I think has been incredibly powerful and refreshing. But then also connecting that to the DV field. So how have those conversations been going? What activities have you been doing?
Lots of one-on-one meetings, right? Lots of one-on-one conversations and that don't just focus on the model. So the other thing that I didn't say is that this is actually what my mother dedicated her life to, was ending domestic violence. And she was doing that in Las Vegas, Nevada, which was the Wild West in the 70s and 80s. And she was actually part of the white feminist movement that perpetuated the criminalization of domestic violence. May she rise in power, with the unintended consequence, right, that then we'd be funneling Black and brown bodies into prison. And so it's been a lot of conversations with some folks that have a lot of time in the field, but also folks that are newer to the field, and merging those conversations about state violence, criminalization of Black and brown bodies, what an actual model would look like, and relying on their expertise. And then it's been great, as we've been developing this guide, to then go back, one of the principles, relationships, and then go, okay, this is what we think. What do you think? And allowing folks to rip it apart and or add, and then collectively putting it back together. So it's been a really collaborative process. I'm rooted in deep political conversation, which is, for me, has been really, really fulfilling. And I'm excited about this next frontier. I mean, I think, Marc, you remember 5 years ago when we were talking about mental health response, same thing. People were like, are you insane? Right? These are violent people walking around with machetes, blah, 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 blah. Some of that still now, but not what it was 5 years ago. And so I'm thinking, 5 years from now, what kind of conversation are we going to be having, and how much healthier is that going to be for our communities?
Thank you, Kat. And I'm going to ask that people ask their questions in the chat, because our last speaker will take us to the close. Krista has been a longtime partner and friend and ally of our work with Healing Together. And we rely on her mightily to help with our policy platform, and to help really give us insight into how these conversations are playing out in the Capitol. I'm going to turn to Krista now to take us home.
Thank you, Marc, and really thank you to everyone who has already spoken, and Kat and Eddie for sharing your stories. So at the partnership, I get the privilege of working not only with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, and many of you on the phone today, but also with all of the domestic violence service providers across the state. And this conversation about shifting away from criminal system responses has been one that we as a field have been engaging in and grappling in alongside a lot of partners over the last several years. It's a key component of our philosophy of how we approach the work as an organization. As a shameless plug for our conference coming up in 2 weeks, it'll be a key component of what you would hear there. But it's also really rooted in all of the experiences that have been shared today, and that we hear from advocates all across the state. I think that there are times when, I just want to name that it's so important for us to remember that domestic violence advocates who are interacting with survivors every day are hearing all of these stories about harms of the criminal system. And I think most of the advocates I get to talk to every day are under no illusions about the damage that the system can do. Many of these programs that I speak with talk about a clear understanding that so long as the criminal system and law enforcement is showing up to domestic violence calls, that they are grappling with the tension of how to be engaged so that that process is less harmful and less hurtful for survivors. And even as Kat shared about, when she was sharing her story of her experience, she wasn't the one who called law enforcement, right? So law enforcement gets involved in domestic violence cases, even when survivors don't want that to happen. And so finding ways to support survivors when they have to deal with that system is very important to programs. But I want to be really clear that there's no requirement when survivors reach out to help to a domestic violence program, to their 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week crisis hotline. There's no requirement or expectation from advocates that they engage that system, right? They will help them through that system if that's a path that they choose or that chooses to insert itself. But that programs are always working to find other ways and other solutions. I also want to name that part of what I really appreciate about these spaces that the Alliance has been holding for us is that our movements have been so siloed in ways that make no sense in the lives of survivors and the lives of families. Even the conversations about batterers intervention programs and working with people who've caused violence has often been so separate from the conversation about those who have experienced violence. And first of all, we treat them as though they're separate silos and separate individuals when we know that that is not true, that many people experience violence and cause violence in their lives, but also as though the two don't connect, right, and aren't essential to each other. And so I think a lot of our work is around shifting that. And as we look ahead, we are looking forward to continuing to lean into solutions and recognizing, as Kat named, the need for community-based service and community-based solutions, looking at what those alternatives can be and how we can work together. There was important legislation that didn't make it through the governor's office this year that we'll look forward to supporting in coming back. But really continuing to build on what those solutions can look like and how to address some of those specific needs that may come up around domestic violence cases in that area. But for the partnership, I will name that our policy work also touches on some of those broader social conditions that I think are really underlying so many of these issues, and especially to some of the challenges we're seeing today during COVID that are exacerbating those needs. Right. And so for us, we think also about the importance of funding specific prevention and working with young people, but also the ways that housing and housing stability and eviction protections and addressing homelessness are part of how we support families, are part of how we decrease the economic stress that families are experiencing and help families stay free from violence. Axel had put the question in the chat about the rise in domestic violence that we've been seeing throughout COVID. And I think there's this almost foregone conclusion that when families have to stay home together, there will inevitably be violence. And our work is to change that narrative, right? And to change that reality. So we're really focused for these next couple of years as well on addressing the economic stress that families are experiencing and how to reduce some of those needs, as well as to address housing needs of families, all of those broader social conditions. And finally, one of our big areas is also around untangling that spider web of where the criminal system engages with survivors. So not just the 911 calls, and not just the healing responses for those who may have committed harm, although those are huge areas of work, and I'm glad to have this complete brain trust of folks to partner with. but also all the ways that that system creeps into other parts of survivors' lives, whether that's access to victims' restitution and financial benefits. For immigrant survivors, the ability to get a U visa and a key path to safety and long-term stability in this country relies on criminal system signature and sign off and quote unquote cooperation with law enforcement, and how we untangle those. How we start to tackle the fact that once law enforcement is involved, so often so is child welfare, and the unbearable harm that it does when we tear families apart. So we've got a lot of work to do, I think, clearly as a field, and I am very excited about the opportunity to bring a lot of these issues together, and the partnerships that have been formed through the Healing Together campaign and the work that keeps bringing this all together. So Marc, thank you for coordinating this, and I'll give you the last minute to close us out.
Thank you so much, Krista, for your tremendous leadership. And thanks to my team who has been doing all the organizing, Kaylin, Jordan, Sybil, Axel, incredible leaders. And a huge thank you to the Blue Shield of California Foundation for their partnership and leadership. They not only resource us all, but they have demonstrated incredible thought leadership on this, being one of the only foundations to focus on intimate partner violence in the state. It is incredible leadership that they are demonstrating in a very, I think, challenging environment where, you know, it's not comfortable or easy to lead from a philanthropic space on these issues. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn to you, Axel, to close us out.
Thanks, Marc. Let's give a virtual round of applause to Marc, Kat, Krista, Sammy, and Skipp, our great panelists today. Really appreciate your enlightening discussion and conversation. Looking forward to joining Healing Together. And I saw that Marc put the link in the chat, so everyone should feel free to join the campaign. Thanks everyone for joining us again. We are planning to do maybe 1 or 2 more of these briefings in the next few months. So keep a lookout from a note from us, and we'll follow up with the recording of this webinar as well, so you can share with your networks. So with that, I'll close us out, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a good rest of your day.